Welcome to this Climate Talks special, concentrating on India. Like many other countries in the region, India is also witnessing the impacts of climate change due to a high level of exposure to different hazards. In particular, the frequency and intensity of climate related disasters have increased the vulnerabilities of communities. And recently, of course, the COVID 19 pandemic has compounded the overall impact of climate induced disasters. To be able to protect lives, livelihoods, and economies at a larger scale, the government of India has been investing in making its disaster risk reduction and climate resilience systems stronger and more efficient. And it's the National Disaster Management Authority, or NDMA, which is leading these efforts in collaboration with state authorities. To learn more about these efforts, we have with us Mr. Kamal Kishore, who is member NDMA India and who comes with a strong technical background in the area of disaster risk reduction and management. Before we discuss the issue, let's put the situation in India into context with this report from Russell Isaac.
The natural hazards facing India are varied and are increasing in frequency and in severity. The Indian subcontinent is exposed to nearly 10% of the world's tropical cyclones. Heat waves and extreme temperatures occur during the summer season, mainly in the northwest. Landslides and avalanches affect large parts of the country, in the Himalayas, the northeastern hill ranges, and the western and eastern Ghats. Urban and rural flooding has continually affected and damaged the country's infrastructure and economy during this century, and over the past 15 years, India has experienced 10 major earthquakes that have resulted in more than 20,000 deaths. The first ever climate change assessment report for India was conducted by the Ministry of Earth Sciences in 2020, and it found that heat waves are projected to be 3 to 4 times higher by the end of the century, with more dry spells and more intense wet spells predicted for the summer monsoon season. These rapid changes in India's climate, alongside droughts and sea level rises projected by climate models, will place increasing stress on the country's natural ecosystems, its agricultural output, its freshwater resources, and will damage infrastructure. India's long coastline, where some of its largest cities are located, is among the most densely populated regions of the planet, making it exceedingly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise. A rise in cyclone intensities will likely result in increasing inundation from the accompanying storm surges that turn nearby agricultural lands and lakes saline and endanger wildlife. The impact of climate change on the availability of fresh water is a critical area of concern, posing threats to the country's water security. In response to the changes at a national level, the Disaster Management Act of 2005 created the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, and the National Disaster Response Force, NDRF, to deal with natural and man-made disasters. The next steps include establishing mitigation funds that will be used for local level and community-based interventions, which reduce risks and promote environment-friendly settlements and livelihood practices. Dedicated educational programs from school to university will vastly improve awareness about climate change and its implications, and such programs could encourage a new generation to contribute through individual and collective efforts that are crucial for climate action. Forests and urban green spaces will deliver substantial economic benefits to the country by mitigating a wide range of the expected impacts of climate change in India, and is the safest, most reliable means of realising several of India's sustainable development goals. The overall aims and policies, therefore, have shown a shift in India's disaster management approach, from being response-centric to now being preparation-centric.
That's given us a picture of India today. Mr. Kamal Kishore, considering the trends of recorded disasters during the past 5 years in India, which particular natural hazards or climate induced threats are likely to have more of an impact in the future?
There's a whole range of hazards that are likely to have impact in the future. So let me start with the first one, which is cyclones. Traditionally, we have invested more on cyclone resilience to cyclonic activity on the East Coast. But what we're seeing in the last 6-7 years is increasing cyclonic activity on the West Coast as well. We are not 100% sure yet whether this is a trend which will last for a long time, but it appears that we are having more cyclonic activity, more cyclones being generated on the West Coast as well. So this has important implications for how we strengthen our systems on the West Coast as well. We've achieved great success on the East Coast in reducing mortality, but we really need to expand the same to the West Coast as well. The same is the issue with flooding, much greater instances of flooding. In fact, there have been years when the overall monsoon's performance in terms of all India rainfall index has been lower than normal, yet there are some parts of the country that have experienced extreme floods. So we really have to focus on improving our flood risk management practices, early warning systems, the flood control measures, traditional flood control measures that are already in place, such as embankments and dikes. They need to be strengthened, better land use planning. Then there's a third category of hazards which can be termed as interconnected mountain hazards, where there's a glacial lake which bursts, so glacial lake outburst flood, which then leads to a landslide in some place or an avalanche, formation of a lake, and then flash flood downstream. So how do you look at these interconnected disasters where geophysical and hydrometeorological disasters connect and really produce a very difficult situation? So we are working towards coming up with an integrated approach for monitoring these interconnected hazards and taking steps to provide as best early warning as we can, and above all, strengthening systems at the community level to respond to those warnings and take actions to save lives and livelihoods. So in other words, on the whole range of hydrometeorological hazards related to wind or water, we are going to see increased frequency and intensity of these events. Some things unprecedented, especially when different hazards connect to come up with much more difficult to predict outcomes or impacts. And putting in community level systems to deal with them is going to be paramount. Above all, a lot of these hazards will impact our infrastructure, and India is a country which still has large infrastructure deficit, and that's why big investment going into building infrastructure. So making that infrastructure resilient for generations to come is a top priority. And it is in this context that India has been working with other countries, 26 other countries, and international organizations to create a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure to advance the notion of disaster resilient power systems, water systems, telecom systems, railways, freight corridors, which can withstand the future climate.
So, how effective is the current DRR system in India to deal with all these natural hazards you have talked about, and especially to ensure that future infrastructure is really disaster resilient?
See, as far as saving lives is concerned, over a period of time, we have had good success. I can highlight two specific hazards. One is cyclone. In the last century, in 20th century, towards the end, in 1999, we had a major super cyclone, Odisha cyclone, where nearly 10,000 people lost their lives. And in this year, in the past year, we've had several cyclones, some of similar intensity as was experienced in 1999, but the loss of lives is in low 2 digits. So we've made big progress there. Likewise, another climate-related hazard, which is looking at heat waves. The instances of heat waves, the hot days is increasing, but the actions that we've been able to take by connecting science to society, taking comprehensive multi-sectorial response, not just looking at public health, but also looking at labor, construction sites, drinking water. By doing all of those things, by connecting science to people and by taking a multi-sectorial approach, from heat wave, we've reduced losses by something like 90%, human losses. But we cannot be satisfied with this. We really need to go beyond and reduce other kinds of losses as well. We have to, of course, save lives, but also save livelihoods. I think that is the mantra for the future. And that requires making our infrastructure services resilient to shocks from natural hazards. And that is the next frontier. So we are working on making sure that power systems do not go down when a cyclone hits, but when it hits, when it does go down, it comes back up and running as quickly as possible. There were times when power would be knocked out in cyclone prone areas or cyclone affected areas for a month. And now, in some cities with underground cabling, with better management system, that recovery time has reduced to just a few days. But that again, that again is not enough. We need to do much more. We need to do similar things in telecom sector so that whenever a cyclone happens, the phone lines keep functioning, or if they get disrupted, they come back up and running very quickly. So that is the focus in the coming years.
So India has experienced actually recently many disasters, especially cyclone and flooding in the thick of this global pandemic. Could you please share some lessons or learning you might have drawn from your recent response to those disasters amidst of COVID-19?
I think there are many lessons, and it was a very challenging time. We've had 5 cyclones during the pandemic, both on east and west coast. The first thing that was very striking was that when the National Disaster Response Force teams go in a normal time, not in a pandemic time, they are actually there to save lives of people who are struck by a cyclone. In this particular case, they not only had to save those people, but also protect themselves from COVID. So we very quickly, this is before the vaccination came online, we very quickly came up with new standard operating procedures to carry out response during the times of COVID. Uh, Protective gear for the staff, uh, different kinds of evacuation procedures for people who are being evacuated to minimize, not completely eliminate, but minimize the risk of spread of infection. In spite of all of that, some 100 response force people themselves were tested positive. Luckily, all of them recovered in good time. So there was a lot of improvisation as more information became available about COVID and the risk it posed to both the affected people as well as the response forces. And we really incorporated that. And of course, once the vaccination came online, we prioritized the National Disaster Response Force, and 98% of them were vaccinated with both doses very, very quickly. So the key lesson from this is that if I were to just highlight one lesson, which is that your standard operating procedures for preparedness and response cannot be frozen in time. They need to continually evolve to respond to new risks that become known. And it's a continuous thing. These have to be dynamic. Once, if they get frozen, then they will become outdated and ineffective.
Okay, my next question actually I wanted to ask, but you were talking about cyclone response during COVID. So I was just wondering that During those kind of times, the role of local governments and communities is central to better response and also for long-term risk reduction. So, given the volume of population of India, how are you addressing these aspects?
I think the role of local government in communities is not just central, they really have to lead. They don't have to participate, they really have to lead. When we talk about our success in reducing mortality from the cyclones, we often talk about the cyclone shelters and the improved early warning, better accuracy of where the landfall is going to occur, etc. But I think equally, and in fact more important, is the fact that there are community level systems. Communities know how to respond to an early warning in an organized fashion. When we talk about cyclone shelters in coastal areas, the story is not that there is a strong cyclone shelter. The story to be told is that these cyclone shelters are multi-purpose and they are managed by communities themselves. These are not managed by the government. If the government manages it, then it is very possible that when a cyclone occurs, the cyclone shelter is either not available or it is not in good condition or you can't find its keys. But if it is managed by the community in their sort of day-to-day lives, throughout the year, and they have organization around it, community organization around it, to ensure that the needs of women, children, old people are met in a systematic way while evacuation and de-evacuation happens. So I think the community organization, community's agency is absolutely central to the success of all disaster risk reduction efforts. This is not a luxury, this is an absolute necessity.
So, lastly, finances are very important to achieve all these goals. So, in the absence of sufficient financial resources, it's very difficult to achieve risk reduction goals that any country has set so far. So, I'm just curious to know that how government of India is ensuring the provision of finances for disaster risk reduction.
So in India, there is a body called the Finance Commission, which is constituted every 5 years, which looks at how central revenues are distributed down to the states and horizontally among them. And one of the thematic areas they look at is disaster risk management. So they provide 5-year allocation to the states for disaster risk management. Till the previous finance commission, all of those resources were for disaster response. That was a good thing, to have predictable amount of resources available readily to the states to efficiently respond to a disaster. Now, from this finance commission onwards, their recommendations were submitted to the government earlier this year. For the first time, we have predictable finance for the entire spectrum of disaster risk management activities. We have resources for response, immediate response. We have resources for recovery and reconstruction, for preparedness and capacity building, as well as disaster mitigation. In all, we've got $25 billion over a 5-year period to cover all of these aspects of disaster risk management. Is that enough? Perhaps not, especially when it comes to disaster risk management or disaster risk reduction. All of that risk reduction should be integrated in the way development happens. But the resources we have from these dedicated windows will be able to catalyze additional financing within the development sectors themselves. So I think that there we have made a big leap this year. But of course, turning policies into implementation is very challenging, and I hope that we will be up to that challenge in the coming years and really show the results. And in a few years, I hope we are in a place where we measure our success not by the amount of money we spent, but the kind of outcomes, risk reduction outcomes we achieved on the ground.
My thanks to Mr. Kamal Kishore for sharing his thoughts during this special episode. Our next episode will come from the climate conference in Glasgow, COP26. Until then, thank you for joining us and goodbye.